Very good evening to Golders Green Synagogue members and those from the broader community joining us this evening. I'm Harvey Belovski. I'm the Senior Rabbi of Golders Green Synagogue, and I'm your host for this evening. This is the beginning of a new series of interviews in conversations that I'm hosting during this period. Like our first series, I'm going to focus on people who can speak to the way the pandemic has changed the world and what that means for our spiritual, personal, and Jewish lives. In this series, as thank God the pandemic is now finally receding, I plan to talk about opportunities as well as fault lines, the moments of growth as well as the threats. This evening, I have the enormous pleasure and privilege to welcome my special guest, the Right Reverend and Right Honourable the Lord Williams of Oystermouth, Rowan Williams. Baron Williams has had an extraordinary and varied career, having been a Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford and Bishop of Monmouth, Archbishop of Wales, and in 2002, he became the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. He served in this post with distinction until the end of his term in 2012, when he became Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. He retired from this position and from the House of Lords in 2020, some 18 months ago, remaining the Chancellor of the University of South Wales, from where he hails. He's an accomplished author, poet, and authority on the works of Dostoevsky. Good evening, Rowan.
Harvey, hello. Thank you very much for your welcome.
And thank you so much for joining us. I've prepared a range of questions, which I hope will be opportunities for a conversation. And there may be a chance for viewers to send in questions in the chat. And if we get an opportunity, and of course they're appropriate, we'll have a look at them if there's time at the end. If I may, let's get going. I'd like to focus first on your time as Archbishop of Canterbury. And as a leader in a non-establishment religious group, I'm intrigued by the relationship between church and state and how that plays out for the religious leader. Rowan, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of this model?
It's a very good question. And I must say, having grown up in Wales, where the Anglican Church is not established by law, I found it quite a challenge moving back to England and discovering all these mysteries about how the establishment worked. So what are the strengths of it? I think two things mostly. One is that abiding feeling that actually the Church of England does have an interest in, a stake in every community in the country. I hope not in a domineering way, but everyone in the country has a right to expect that the Church will help to look after their interests. And the second thing grows out of that, and it's something which I think the Church of England has had to learn a bit slowly in the last few decades. If everyone in the country has a right to expect that the Church takes an interest in them, then of course that applies to other faith communities as well as Anglicans and Christians. And I found as Archbishop of Canterbury that one of the things, perhaps one of the surprising things about the job, was that it gave one a bit of a platform for gathering people from diverse religious communities to think about and to speak about matters of common interest in the country. So there are some positives. The negatives, I suppose, are really mostly to do with the fact that it can go with a sense of entitlement and a sense of, the Church of England being what all reasonable chaps belong to. And I do mean chaps. And, there are some drawbacks to that, to put it mildly.
Well, it reminds me of one of the thoughts that we always had when we visited certain places, some of which you were at, that the Church of England certainly had all the best buildings. That was really clear.
We do quite well on that front.
That was the starting point. Picking up on your first point about its strengths and about its taking an interest in all communities, even though it's outside the Anglican Communion, I note that Prince Charles has said in the past that when the time comes for him to be king, he'd like to be defender of faiths rather than defender of the faith. How do you think that might play out in practice? It isn't too indiscreet question.
Prince Charles is somebody who's got a very strong commitment to understanding other faith traditions. he's got probably what is rather deeper a commitment than some people realize to aspects of traditional Christianity. But he's always been hospitable and open to other traditions, and I think he has really internalized that sense that if there's any justification for having a religious establishment, it has to be something that has to serve the entire community. So I think, like his mother, he would see the role of being defender of the faith not as, if you like, being a paid champion of one particular point of view, but as someone who, as part of their, I won't say their job, but their vocation, has the task of keeping the perspective of faith alive in public discourse. And that means drawing on all those traditions of faith that are around.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I want to turn slightly away from that to a more contemporary challenge. In our community, that's, I would say, specifically my synagogue, but certainly in the synagogue Jewish communities, there's a lot of angst about getting people back to synagogue post-pandemic. In many communities, numbers are down, there's a nervousness, and there are people who are out the habit of attending, even perhaps when they're not so nervous. And it's also, I think, for some people, if one wants to be entirely honest, a chance to break with something that they were perhaps already ambivalent about. And it's given an opportunity to spend their Saturday mornings or other occasions doing things they perhaps rather more enjoy. A colleague who may be watching wisely said to me last year, and I've quoted this many times, the pandemic, certainly in the Jewish community, has magnified or accelerated pre-pandemic realities for communities. And so with that kind of, well, I'm absolutely certain that this concern and reality is shared by many other faith communities. It's not in any way unique to the Jewish community. What strategies do you think, Rowan, might work in churches and perhaps more broadly for houses of worship to get people back in the habit? What can we do to make it appealing for them?
Huge question. And of course, we do share exactly that problem. But, looking back over the last couple of years, and I don't know what it's been like in the Jewish community, but certainly for us, there's been a kind of glass half empty, glass half full feeling. On the one hand, yes, we have lost a lot of physical regular attenders. On the other hand, people have tuned in who might not otherwise have done. People have made connections across the globe, which they might not otherwise have done, have tuned in to worship and study from other continents. And actually, I've known a few Jewish friends who have found their commitment really deepened and enriched by discovering all sorts of resources in the United States, which have really opened things up for them.
Yes.
And for us, as Anglicans, I think there has been a bit of a sense that we've managed to open a door and keep it open for people who might find coming through a literal church door rather a challenge. So that's a slightly more positive thing. However, we can't just go on treating the online, the digital, as normal to the extent that our traditions, yours and ours, do put a lot of value on where you put your flesh and blood, where you put your skin, and how to restore that sense of the significance of sheer bodily proximity, being alongside the people you haven't necessarily chosen, but God has. I think that's one of the difficulties, because I would say that one of the most important things about belonging to the kind of religious community that you do and we do is the feeling that who we are with at the end of the day isn't just up to us. It's up to the Almighty. And how we are to learn from God depends a great deal on the unexpected and possibly not always welcome people that we're jammed up next to and can't avoid. If everything is just online, there's always that temptation to find the people you're comfortable with. And
Yes,
therefore we learn that.
Ones you're not.
So in terms of strategy, who knows? I suspect that it'll take time. And the taking of time is something which will be it'll work in all sorts of areas of our lives. I don't think we will be moving to a sort of massively monochrome digital civilization within the next 18 months. I think there will be people rediscovering the theatre and the dance hall as they already are. And if they rediscover that, there's at least the possibility they'll rediscover the physical place of worship and recognize what they've missed. Of course, it's a good excuse to do things long distance where you don't have to get out of your armchair or your bed. On the other hand, it has been an opportunity for people to think a little bit about what it is they actually value about the physical contact, the literal being together as flesh and blood, and perhaps even what they learn from those people they haven't chosen, the surprises that they encounter.
Now, I like that very much. I mean, I think that it aligns much with their own experience, that there have been some wonderful opportunities for different types of Jewish experience through the internet. We, in the right time, have streamed programs, and this is an example. I can't quite imagine doing something like this even a couple of years ago, but it's quite normal. You don't live near where my community is, and the opportunity to have someone like you is a tremendous honor, but it's also possible. Without enormous inconvenience, to do it this way, in a way that's quite acceptable to large numbers of viewers. And there are some fantastic aspects of the kind of take-homes from the pandemic, which I imagine will remain with us. But I also feel very strongly, and I think some of our more restrictive rules that have frustrated congregants about not permitting using technology on the Sabbath and festivals, which have had its downsides, without question force people to kind of value perhaps the opportunity to be together and what it really means to share a space and to experience God in a group with the people you like and the people you didn't know were going to be there, and with the people you wouldn't there either. So I really sympathize with that. Thank you. So here's a more pastoral question, which is, I know that many of my colleagues, and I suspect many other faith leaders, are really struggling with this re-engagement. Do you have a kind of word of encouragement or inspiration for faith leaders who may be watching this, who are a little take-home for them as they're kind of struggling to re-engage their congregants as the pandemic gradually, thank God, starts to fade?
First and foremost, I think the confidence of any leader in a faith community has to come from the sense that they are trusted. They're trusted to do the work. Something is given into their hands. And I would say that that's the foundation of the proper confidence we ought to have. Second thing is to remember that the work of the community is the work of the community, not an individual. Others are there to be, I won't say to be used, but to be drawn in to a common work, to witness together, to make sense together. And it's very tempting, isn't it? And you'll find this as much as I do, very tempting to think it's all on my shoulders. If you remember that it's on your shoulders because God thinks you can carry it, and it's on your shoulders along with lots of other shoulders carrying it, that can be the beginning of wisdom, I suspect.
Thank you. I think people will appreciate that. Now, I want to turn to something rather different. I, as many, consider you to be a strong and loyal friend to the Jewish community. Over the years, we've met to discuss student issues, anti-Semitism on British campuses, and you were very kind enough to help us with my University Jewish Chaplaincy major fundraising event last year. How would you characterize your relationship with the UK's Jewish community during your tenure as Archbishop of Canterbury? And then since, if you want to add on something.
During my time as Archbishop, obviously one of the dominant things was a friendship with Lord Sachs.
That's my next question. Right.
Well, the fact that we found ourselves standing together, speaking together, working together on quite a number of occasions. So I have memories of, for example, a visit to a secondary school in Pimlico with Jonathan. I have memories of Holocaust Memorial Day events alongside him. Memories, very vivid memories of the visit we made together to Auschwitz with a group of other faith leaders from the UK. And really quite a lot more besides. That, I suppose, was the golden thread in all this. But alongside that, there were a good many other contacts. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the settlement of the ongoing dialogue group with the chief rabbinate in Israel. And that took me to Jerusalem to meetings with representatives of the chief rabbinate in Israel, not only the chief rabbis of the day, but figures like David Rosen and Yashuv Cohen, and the extraordinary perspective and wisdom derived from those meetings. And I think I mentioned David and Yashuv Cohen particularly.
Mm-hmm.
That was both a testing and stretching and a very enriching encounter. And I'm very glad that that international dimension was there, as well as relations with local communities. Since that time, I've continued to engage with various Jewish groups. Thanks partly to your encouragement and introduction, I developed a very happy relationship with the chaplaincy in Cambridge, and we were proud and happy at our college to welcome the former Jewish chaplains, the couple, as honorary members of our college high table. And I was invited to go and speak at the synagogue in Cambridge, and did that with great gratitude and appreciation on my part. So yes, it's been I think a warm and constructive relationship. And I've also always valued the opportunity at a more academic level of being, I think quite rightly, pushed by Jewish friends and colleagues to think about the neuralgic issues around our Christian-Jewish relations, which don't go away in a hurry. And to think hard about, I suppose, the vocabulary that Christians so often take for granted, which can convey negative and demeaning messages without quite meaning it to the Jewish community. We still have a huge amount of homework to do on that.
No, that's greatly appreciated. And I see subsequent in the last 10 years or so since you stepped down, I see in some of the relationships that I've built and other senior leaders have built, there are traces of that in an openness to engage in certain conversations around difficult narratives, historic difficulties, and theological clashes, some of which would be very difficult to eliminate altogether. But that is appreciated. It's also appreciated there's an honestness, an honesty, to willingness to talk about it, because some of these things just are built in, and they've been there a long time, and it will take, as I said, they're not about to go away overnight. But not acknowledging them prevents progress, and we're very grateful for that. So you mentioned, or you got there first, but there's some more personal matters, as you all know, that Rabbi Sachs was not just a global faith leader and a dear friend, mentor, and he was the former rabbi of the synagogue that I lead as well. And as you probably know, Jonathan Elaine retired back to the synagogue where he started his career, ours, and in the last 7 years of his life, he was an active congregant, and I had the great or dubious pleasure of him sitting there every time I gave a sermon, but he was entirely inscrutable, and so he never gave away when undoubtedly many times he thought it wasn't really terribly good. It was a matter of some interest that you and Jonathan announced your intention to step down from your roles at around the same time. It did lead me to a suggestion in a sermon that neither organisation need seek a new leader, and you could simply swap. And this was the kind of joke was invariably received. But joking apart. You said a little bit about your relationship with Rabbi Sachs, primarily in your role as Archbishop, standing with him at important local and international events. Could you offer perhaps a personal insight in perhaps something which he may have contributed to a conversation, or something you particularly miss in his rather sad absence?
A sad absence indeed, and his death was a great shock. But I think particularly of his contribution at the Lambeth Conference in 2008, I was very determined that we should have, at this big international gathering of Anglican bishops from around the world, that we should have some input from outside our own ranks. And so I tried to make sure that we had representation and contribution from people from a wide range of backgrounds. A speaker from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, a cardinal from Rome, and of course the absolutely obvious candidate in the UK was Jonathan. And I remember that what he did for us was to present in his own inimitable way a reading of Hebrew scripture, a reading of the nature of covenant, which spoke right to the heart of some of our concerns as an Anglican family. We were thinking quite a lot about the idea of covenant ourselves. The word covenant was around as a model for the kind of agreement we might try to make between the different parts of the Anglican communion around the world to try and minimize unexpected and irresoluble conflicts and collisions. But what Lord Sachs did was, I think, to drive us right to the heart of why covenant might matter, and the different kinds of togetherness, the different kinds of communion, which could be created under God for human beings. And that was such a profound and such a fresh exposition of the subject that I think the entire conference was deeply moved and deeply affected by it. I certainly was myself. So I think of that occasion very particularly. I also think of Sabbath Eve meals with Jonathan and Elaine and exchanges over the dinner table and study around the dinner table, the exchange of perspectives on scripture, and dusting off my extremely rusty Hebrew to try and rise to the occasion just a little bit.
Well, yes, it would have been nice to be a fly on the wall. And before I turn away from this subject altogether, do you have a favourite Jewish joke?
Ooh, it's a temptation to be deeply politically incorrect, isn't it? Yeah.
Fire away.
If I do have a favourite Jewish joke, it is one that I can genuinely say I heard from Jewish sources, and that is the Jewish mother sending her son a telegram in the old days, simply saying, "Start worrying, details to follow."
Very good. We like that. That definitely qualifies. Thank you.
I've quoted that to a number of people without even the religiously specific context, because I think if you're Welsh, there is something you immediately recognise about that also.
Now, more broadly, as a spiritual leader, who, given the kind of very specific nature of the esteemed office that you held, it's difficult, perhaps inevitable, that one will get caught up in certain political issues. And anyone who has a kind of a role outside of a narrow parochial community, to some degree, I have this type of role, it becomes an interesting battle to ensure that one balances the two. One needs to be relevant. But on the other hand, one doesn't want to get caught up in political issues. How did you, or would you recommend that leaders balance the two?
Very hard to generalize about it, but for me, it was a matter of making sure that I kept my relationships with the grassroots as fresh and direct as I could. One thing I rather missed moving to Canterbury from my work in Wales was that I wasn't any longer, as it were, automatically going out to the local parishes on Sundays, week after week. So what I tried to do was to make sure that as often as I could, perhaps once a fortnight, I could be in a parish in my diocese in Kent, that I could be in, Margate or Benenden or Folkestone or wherever, and just taking an ordinary Sunday morning service and spending some time afterwards with the congregation, drinking coffee and eating buns, and simply getting a feel for what was happening. And in a slightly different way, that also played out in making sure that every year I'd perhaps on 2 occasions spend a few days in one of the dioceses in England, going round with the bishop, visiting community projects, prisons, hospitals, schools. It was a bit random, really. I'd just write to the bishop and say, could we fix, say, 3 days in September when I could just spend some time with you, and you can think what you'd like me to see and what you'd like me to hear about. And I remember planning one such visit and saying to the bishop, what do you think would be helpful? And the bishop saying, most people in our parishes read about the Church of England in the newspapers, and they don't recognize what they read about. they read about this soap opera of church politics and controversy, and it doesn't actually connect very much with where they are and what their issues are. What I'd like you to do, he said, is to show them that you, as somebody they might read about in the papers, and the church at large, do know where the shoe pinches for them and are ready to listen. And I thought that was so important, and I've never forgotten that. So for me, it was very much a matter of that extremely basic thing. Just be there alongside and pick up what's going on. Because if you lose that, you don't just lose something in terms of policy and strategy. You lose your own awareness of what is good news. You lose your own awareness of how God works in ordinary lives. And that's lethal if you're in a position of religious responsibility of any kind, isn't it?
But I can see that one moves into a meta role, that one can very easily lose connection with the people one is serving. It really does make very good sense. I thank you. I appreciate that answer. And on the back of that, I've noticed the temptation when speaking or writing to focus on contemporary issues, and that can be to the exclusion of discussing God, faith, and religion. What advice can you give to me about remaining true to one's mission, but while still remaining relevant, i.e. speaking to issues that really concern people's lives rather than the abstract?
Part of it is to do with the kind of faith we have in God. And that is a faith that the God we're talking about actually is a God who makes a difference in those ordinary lives I was just speaking of. So to talk of God truthfully, faithfully, to talk of God on the basis of the scriptures that we read and meditate on, we ought to be doing that in the confidence that what is said there will ring bells. Sometimes in the church, the slogan has been used about reading scripture, the Latin phrase, de te loquitur, this is talking about you. And to me, that's one of the things you ought to be doing in preaching. It's to be able to talk about Abraham, Daniel, Ruth, or for us, Paul, or John, or James, or Mary, in a way that allows people to say, you know, I see what that's about. That converges with my sense of what being human before God is about. One of the most heartening things I ever heard was many years ago when I was a curate in a council estate parish, and we had a weekly study group, and during our Lent period, our pre-Easter period, I decided one year we should have Holy Communion in my house, informally in our front room, every week when we had the Bible study group. And at the end of one session, one of the local women said to me, you know, what we're doing now is what they were doing at the beginning of Christianity, wasn't it? They were meeting in people's houses and talking about the Bible together and breaking bread. I thought, yes, got it in one. That's it.
That's good. Of course, this is talking to you. We're familiar in the Jewish community that the rabbi attempts to deliver the message, and the person in the pew says they're talking to you, the person next to them, rather than them. But yes, I think that's much appreciated. I'm going to move in a slightly different direction. We actually met after your retirement as Archbishop, and when you were Master of Magdalen in Cambridge, you were chairing a think tank that was hosted by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission around how religion was experienced and represented in public life, of which I was a core member. I remember there was a particularly memorable meeting, which was in your lodgings in Cambridge, and we came there. They were in various places, mostly in London, but I do remember sitting with Giles Fraser. They were very, very long. Do you remember they was 3 hours each of these? They were absolutely determined. And so on. They did bring some experts, and they usually had quite a reasonable kosher lunch. But actually, for me, I hope I made a contribution, but I made some very important relations. I met you there at the time. Giles and I subsequently became very close friends. We were in regular contact. And these were have been some very valuable friendships. We're several years on from that process about imagining or considering the strengths and weaknesses of the way religion is experienced and represented in public life. What do you think are the three current core conflicts between a life of faith and the mores or direction of current secular society?
Oh, that's a very hard one.
You don't have to give three. You may give fewer or more if you
Well,
prefer.
let me see what I can do. I think the first real conflict, I think, is that our society hugely privileges individual choice and internal autonomy. Now, it's not that religious communities are necessarily oppressive or tyrannical, though Lord knows they can be, but we as people of faith believe we are answerable to something or someone. We're summoned, we're spoken to before we speak, and therefore we're always trying to fit our lives to something which is much greater and much more resilient, resourceful, deep, and real than we are. And the general climate of our society doesn't really work like that. The sense that we are accountable in that way. And of course, let's be blunt. The political culture we're in at the moment, as we're currently seeing, does not seem to have a highly developed sense of responsibility, or the need to be accountable and truthful to how things truly are, and I find that so disheartening. So that's one area. The second thing is we are, of course, and it's connected with the first, we're a very short-termist culture. We like to see instant results. We like to see bangs for the buck. We like to see quick fixes. We, particularly, I think, in the Jewish and Christian worlds, we have quite a long story to tell. And I think it's not at all insignificant that the story of Jewish and Christian scripture unfolds over millennia. It's not a once and for all instantaneous thing. It's intrinsically a story of listening, mishearing, rediscovering, being called and then recalled. We walk away and we're hauled back. And so it goes on. And that deep sense of learning through the passage of time, I'd say, is very much in tension with a short-termist culture looking for quick and easy solutions. And if you want a third thing, I suppose it's something to do with how we understand human beings themselves, the sense of the mysteriousness of human beings, the sense of both fate and freedom in human beings. We swing between two extremes, don't we, in our culture? There are philosophers and thinkers who seem really to enjoy the idea that we're really just machines. And at the same time, so much of that culture tells us we're absolutely free to do whatever we please. And it's a very strange oscillation. But we, believers in this tradition, would say we are both the inheritors of an awful lot of things that constrain and confine our possibilities. We are answerable to a God whom we have not made. It is he who has made us and not we ourselves, as the psalmist says. Lo anachnu. And
he was pretty good, notwithstanding our earlier self-deprecating remarks.
Well, and that sense of, we're not completely free in a consumer sense. At the same time, we are made in God's image, and we are summoned to reflect that divine creativity and abundance of giving and shaping the lives of others around us in the world in freedom. So, our tradition does say to us that we are not simply free agents in a void, and neither are we machines. And discovering that and working that out, well, that's the challenge, that's the glory. That's the really exciting agenda we've been given. And I'm sure anybody coming from a rabbinical tradition would agree. the
Yes, I
difficulty.
agree. Quite a
That is,
memorable answer. Actually, I'm going to have to play that one back after when I watch the recording, and that's quite a memorable answer. Thank you. I need to dwell on that, and because I notice that I work in rabbinic recruitment part of the time, and I kind of I can see that kind of perhaps it's kind of post pandemic fatigue, but I do feel that there's a real sense of divergence between the demands, expectations of a life of faith, and some of the more individualistic aspects of contemporary society. And I think that this might make people of some capability question whether this type of religious life is for them. But at my end, more of a concern still that they may have leadership potential and perhaps won't realize that leadership potential. Do you have a piece of advice for someone who will be considering entering the ministry, perhaps in the Church of England, or maybe more usefully for our audience, into the rabbinate? Do you have a kind of piece of advice, given these tensions and divergences, which might deter them?
the image I sometimes use with people thinking about ministry in our church or ordination in our church is an image drawn from our liturgical habits in church. When I celebrate Holy Communion, one of the gestures that traditionally the celebrant makes at various points is simply to open their hands in prayer and to open your arms. And I say that's the gesture you make when you're flinging open some doors. So first of all, your job is opening doors. And then, of course, when you've opened doors in real life, you don't just stand in the door, you get out of the way so that people can come in. So one of the things I'd want to know from anybody thinking about ministry is, have they got the confidence and enthusiasm to fling open the doors? And have they got the humility and realism to get out of the way so that other people can discover and not stand?
I like that very much. Thank you. I like that very much. Thank you. I have to think. I think this is now advice which is more important than just for people considering entering. And I think it's for people who are in it. Well, so thank you. I like
it myself every day.
Your breadth as a thinker and spiritual leader is astounding. I have found you able to talk about almost anything with knowledge and authority. And at the risk of embarrassing you, if I haven't already done so, I also consider you one of the most spiritual and genuine people I've met. Now, you're a published poet. Could you speak a little about religious expression through poetry and how this might differ from other modes of communication?
Poetry is language doing strange things. It's language under pressure. Even the most traditional forms of poetry, using rhyme and meter, you're doing rather funny things to the language. And you're doing strange things to language because you think, push it a bit, and you don't quite know where it might go, what might be discovered in that process. So I think writing poetry is something to do with discovering what language can do, discovering what language can tell you. And it's in that sense, not in any kind of vague impressionistic sense, it's in that sense that all religious language is in some way poetic. It's language slightly out of its comfort zone and put under pressure by the immediacy of God so that something new comes through. And for me, that's what is at the heart both of trying to talk about God in general and about trying to write poetry. And although I've written some poems that you might call religious poems, they're not all of them religious, except that the entire operation for me is in some sense an act of faith in language that God has given us as human beings, the extraordinary, exhilarating grace to do strange things with language and discover something through that.
So just as a rider, which is not in my notes, but it occurs to me as we're speaking, which is that, are your poems generated spontaneously from a moment of inspiration, a religious moment, or do you kind of sit down to write some poetry? This is something which I've wondered, not just about you, but others. I can't say that poetry is something which I've ever really I've read poetry, but I don't regard myself any kind of expert. And the best I can usually come up with is a rather slightly off-color limerick. And so but how does it happen, this poetic experience that produces something worthy of publication and contemplation by others?
It varies a lot from writer to writer. I think there are some people who do sit down and try to write poems every day, recognizing that most of them won't be much good, but that you need to keep your hand in. Others, like myself, I think do depend rather on what may strike them unexpectedly. And that may be an image, a visual image. It may be a phrase or a word. Suddenly something comes to mind, a little cluster of words, a little metaphor, or even, well, I suppose even a phrase you might see in passing, a headline, a notice. I wrote a poem a few years ago called "Please Close This Door Quietly," which was about going into a church. It was written for the Historic Churches Trust. And of course, often in visiting a historic church, you'll see that notice on the door saying, "Please close this door quietly." And I suddenly thought, well, okay, let's go with that. Let's see where that phrase takes me. So sometimes it's like that. Again, I can remember writing a poem, or a poem starting when I was on a retreat in a monastery in Europe, going for a walk, going past a pond with a lot of tadpoles. And for some reason, the tadpoles, as it were, spoke to me. And I looked at all those little black shapes in the water, looking like commas. And a whole train of imagery started up about words and punctuation and frogs and tadpoles. Don't ask me to go to the details, but that was just something that triggered it. And very, very rarely, something will come almost as a whole. An almost complete poem will unfold. A picture, a moment of reflection, and suddenly you hear how it might all go. That's very rare, but it's rather treasurable. I've sometimes said it's as if the poem kind of opens the door, walks in and sits down and puts its feet up. But that's not such a common experience for me.
I think one of the things that emerges from this touches on perhaps the way I was thinking of you and mentioned before, which is that you seem to have an openness to a spiritual experience or a moment of inspiration, an opportunity to kind of experience God in the world in all kinds of spaces and places rather than necessarily formal settings. And I suspect that the kind of poetic inspiration goes together with that. And I think that that's something which certainly those who are very used to formal places of worship, formal services, formal liturgy, I'm a great believer in these formalities, but I also can see that they occasionally are a replacement, whether they should be complementary to spontaneous religious experience. And what I think you're describing, another outlet for this spontaneity, which does not have to be contradicted by, but shouldn't be replaced by the formalities of religion.
Absolutely, yes. And of course that has an effect backwards, as it were, on how we think about formal worship. We sometimes need to be reminded how very strange the things are we say when we meet together and listen to scripture and sing together. The extravagance, the strangeness of the imagery we use, it rolls over us. We've heard it all before, and occasionally it's a wonderful grace to think, my goodness, that's a strange thing to say. What kind of depth of experience must have generated that kind of strangeness? And that enhances our sense of God, I think.
Yes, I think that you're right. In a very kind of a slightly related but tangential question, I've been a Dostoevsky enthusiast since my undergraduate days, and I've read most of his major works. I'd like to make this clear for anyone listening. I've read them in translation into English. He was a complex character with genius mixed in with some deeply unpleasant characteristics, not least his overt and quite extreme hatred for Jews. Could you explain your interest in Dostoevsky and how his ideas align with or diverge from your faith?
Like you, I first read Dostoevsky in my teens, and found that there were very few other writers who seemed to go for the spiritual jugular in quite the same
Yes,
way.
yes, agreed.
He pushes your nose into the most difficult areas of human motivation and relationship, and he invites you to see a world which is both deeply scarred and damaged by human perversity, and yet always transparent to something of God. That amazing passage in Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan Karamazov is arguing with Alyosha, his brother, about the existence of God, and Ivan is talking about the unspeakable cruelty of human beings, especially to children.
Yes.
Says he wants to return his ticket to God, and then he says, "But I can't give up on the world, the sticky little buds in the spring." And that little detail, the sticky little buds in the spring, which Ivan keeps talking about, that tells us such a great deal about Dostoevsky himself. He sees the vileness of the world, the human world he's in.
And experienced much of it directly, including
Yes,
being
yes,
treated, sentenced to death, and many other pretty
that's right.
horrible personal experiences.
Terrible experiences. It's a terrible life. And yet the sticky little buds keep coming back. So that's the greatness of him as a writer, I think. And then, as you say, it's all mixed in with this utterly extraordinary Russian nationalist mythology, which includes toxic levels of anti-Semitism. And it's so difficult. It's as if, how should I put it? It's as if he himself exemplifies the contradictions he's talking about. In him, the perversity and the awfulness of human nature, and the insight and the beauty sitting side by side. And he wasn't a saint. He was a genius. He was not infallible. He wasn't a man of impeccable morality. And yet something is given to him that he sees and transmits. And that's one of the mysteries, often, isn't it, with great creative minds. You say, I cannot understand how a person with such bizarre ideas and opinions could still see the truth about certain things in a way that brings you up short like that.
Yes, there are many scenes that are quite unforgettable. This kind of realism, but also it's the conflict, as you say, that he sees in them. There's an underlying positivity. I mean, as you said, mentioned one. There are many others. Do you have a favourite work of Dostoevsky, and if so, what might it be and why?
My favourite among the novels, to be honest, is Devils.
I've only read that once, and it's quite a number of years ago, so you may have to remind me and the audience the approximate theme.
It's really about a little radical group in a provincial town in Russia. And one of the central figures is the sort of convener of this group of nihilistic radicals, Pyotr. And he is an extraordinary creation. He's a completely conscienceless character. He's fluent and talkative and charming and absolutely empty. And into that void, everything gets sucked. The people around him get drawn in. And he's ruthless, murderous, as it turns out. And that's one portrait of extraordinary power, because Dostoevsky is almost preternaturally sensitive to the way in which a certain kind of political radicalism can be really a falling in love with chaos for its own sake. And he saw that around him. And we've seen it in the 20th century and the 21st century too, that is a real temptation. And some people in power create that vortex of destructiveness around them. So that's one extraordinary aspect of it. Another, of course, is an aspect of the novel which was not known about until the full version was published well into the 20th century, because one crucial chapter was suppressed. And that is the chapter where one of the other central figures confesses to an appalling act of child abuse, the rape of a small girl. and the rape and subsequent suicide of a small girl. And it is, I find it almost unbearably painful to read. It's as if a kind of distillation of utter evil gets onto the page. And this is a story that's shared by this particular figure, Nikolai Stavrogin, with an old priest whom he's come to. He says he needs to confess this dreadful sin, and not only confess it, but make it public. He needs to humiliate himself in public. And the old priest listens, and then he says to him, a real confession is a real emptying of self. What you want to do is make yourself an interesting sinner. And it's a startling moment. And of course, Stavrogin draws back and says, you don't understand anything. You damned psychologist, he says. And he walks away. But you've had that glimpse into the abyss, really. It's a horrifying chapter. So,
this presumably was suppressed because the content was understood to be too expressing.
Too shocking. Yeah. At the same time, just to redress the balance, I think Devils is Dostoevsky's funniest novel. It's a very odd thing to say. People don't think of him as a comic writer.
It sounds so funny. You haven't made it very funny so far.
Well, no, but the description of the workings of the radical group, those of us who were students in the 60s and 70s will remember student political meetings that are uncannily like some of the ones Dostoevsky describes. And his satirical eye is very sharp. And he's also got a very sharp eye for blathering old liberals and the sort of well-meaning nonsense spouted by people who like to think they're at the cutting edge of culture.
Yes, that's right. Ineffective, sanctimonious, and so on.
Ineffective, sanctimonious, self-flattering.
Right. Yes.
And it's funny. It's cruel, but it is very, very funny.
Yes, I'm not sure it's only student meetings from the 70s which were like that. I think there are many meetings that one could identify today that sound remarkably similar.
Surely not.
Thank you. I look down now, seem I'm going to have to go and take my Devils off the shelf in my office and give it another dust off. But thank you. I think we're coming to the end. We've kept you for more than I have only one question remaining, which is, what do you think, Rowan, is the greatest challenge of being a believer today?
How to express belief with the right kind of confidence, not to apologize. We're so used to thinking of the mistakes we've made as believers, especially Christians, and especially Christians in regard to their Jewish brothers and sisters, I have to say. We're so used to acknowledging that we've been triumphalist, exclusivist, and all the rest of it. And yet, we, people of faith, do need to find a confidence that says to the world, you know what? Belief makes the world larger rather than smaller. There's more air to breathe. There's more room to move in. There's more beauty to see. There's more depth to experience. That's why I'm a believer. It's because of all that. And you don't need to apologize for that. But how to convey that in a sense that really invites people, that's the challenge.
Well, it's a good place to end, because it seems to me certain, given the great range and breadth we've covered in this conversation, that I think you're a person who exemplifies this, who have been able to kind of find a way of articulating faith and ideas in a way that has spoken to all kinds of people in many spheres. We've covered only a small number of areas of your expertise. You touched on our great deeply missed leader, Rabbi Sachs. I think he shared that ability to find the right language to confidently and unapologetically articulate belief and ideas and connection to ancient ideas translated into a modern idiom. And so I think that at 5 to 9, we're going to bring this to an end. I've certainly run out of questions, and it means I have time to just about write. And Rowan, it remains for me to thank you very much indeed for your time, for your energy, for your confidence that I would run this in a way that didn't in any way embarrass you or myself. and to deepen our friendship. And I know that the many people who have been watching live and then will watch it on Catch Up later will really greatly appreciate your thoughts about the Jewish community, faith in general, your fond memories of Rabbi Sachs, and also your willingness to engage with us and share your wisdom. Thank you so much, and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harvey. Thank you all.